Right now, though, I want to turn from this kind of more abstract intellectual conservatism that's represented by people like Yoram Hazony to the kind of nationalistic authoritarian conservatism that is all too commonly has real world power right now. And so I want to welcome Jean Bajalan to the program. He's among many, many other things I could mention, his academic work and everything else. The part that's of particular interest to me right now is an article that he wrote a few years ago. He co-wrote with our late friend Michael Brooks, called America's AKP, about the analogy between Erdogan's party, the ruling party in Turkey, and the American GOP. And I thought this might be a really interesting time, given a lot of what's going on lately, to revisit that analogy. How are you doing, Gene?
Thank you so much for having me on.
Yeah, no, I'm really glad that you came on. So in this article that you wrote with Michael a few years ago, I mean, I guess just to set the scene a little bit, right? So this had to do with a kind of diplomatic incident that had happened at the time in 2017. So maybe we could just get rolling with you kind of recapping that and also saying a little bit like what the AKP is, right? Like what is the like ideological nature of this ruling party in Turkey?
Sure. So the initial context of the article was an attack on protesters in Washington, D.C. by Erdogan, the president of Turkey's security detail. And, you know, they basically charged out into demonstrators, beating them, and basically got away with it at the end of the day. But of course, you know, this was roundly condemned, not by the president, of course. And, you know, from reading Bolton's book, Trump has quite an affinity for Erdogan, is very impressed with Erdogan. But many Republicans and Democrats condemn this action. And basically the context of us writing this article was, you know, vintage Michael. You know, I was discussing with him about this incident, and we were discussing about how, you know, Erdogan's rule in Turkey is becoming increasingly thuggish, and how a lot of the pearl clutching amongst Republicans, you know, at the time you had people like John McCain was still alive, you know, very upset that this would happen. But, you know, these complaints are happening exactly at the same time as Republican legislators across the country were moving to make demonstration and protest far more difficult in the United States. And that basically sort of led to a kind of conversation about, you know, when we look at it, you know, there's quite interesting parallels between the Republican Party and its specifically its drift and its trajectory today, and the development of the Justice and Development Party, AKP, according to its Turkish acronym. So we decided to sort of write a piece about how, you know, all this pearl clutching on behalf of Republicans about this violence that Erdogan was visiting on protesters in DC was really, you know, kind of ridiculous when looked at in the context of their political actions and their opposition to free assembly and protest. So that's kind of the first part of it. And I guess the second part, for those people who are not so familiar with Turkey, the Justice and Development Party is a conservative political party that came to power in Turkey in 2002. It initially came to power sort of presenting itself as a liberal conservative party, very much on the model of the Christian Democrats in Germany. And since coming to power, and sort of more precisely since about 2010, 2011, it's increasingly gone in this authoritarian populist way. And we see a lot of the sort of same, you know, a lot of comparisons can be a little bit trite, but we see a lot of the same types of discourse, conspiracy, the notion of an oppressed moral majority, you know, all these kind of common themes we see between the development of the Republican Party and the trajectory of the Justice and Development Party in Turkey. And, like I said, you can draw, there are very serious differences between Turkey and the United States, but you do sort of see Trumpism and Erdoganism in a kind of as similar phenomena.
Yeah, so I want to get into that a little bit, right? So yeah, you do say in the article, of course, Trump, and I always mispronounce his name, Erdogan, have very dissimilar biographies, right? Trump was born with multiple silver spoons in his mouth, and Erdogan was not, right? Like I think Erdogan even spent some time in prison earlier in his career. So as the personalities are very different in some ways, but certainly the political appeal is pretty similar in some ways, right? So like one pretty obvious point of connection there, besides like the base of support, right? Who's like what sort of having this element of the population that's a non-elite group, kind of far from the levers of power. That makes up a lot of the base, and using certain kinds of populist rhetoric, but also in both cases not governing as economic populists, right, to put it mildly.
Yeah, I mean, to a certain degree, the populism in Turkey is more real than in the United States. I mean, one of the key differences between the American and the United States is, American corporate interests and elites are so much more sort of embedded in political power that even if there is a drive to make changes, it's almost impossible to go against those sort of institutions. In Turkey, there is a powerful business interest in elites, but it's a developing country, so the context is very different. So, for example, Erdogan did populist things like improving public services. He had the infrastructure of a sort of a weak social democratic state to build upon, and he did things like delivering coal to poor people and things like that. So there is some differences on that level, but in general, the AKP and the Republican Party have been ruling in big business, in the interests of big business, and they draw their base of support from poor people in the heartland of the country. It builds on that resentment against what they see as liberal elites, whether in the United States that's the coastal elites of California and New York, or in Turkey it is the cities of Istanbul and Izmir, which are seen as being sort of detached from the rest of the country. So they draw on that, and at the same time, they draw on a base of an elite base, which presents itself as being culturally closer to that mass of people, but is a business elite. So in Turkey, you have these capitalists from central Anatolia who weren't the traditional capitalist elite of Turkey, and they became a very important base of support. And just as in the United States, you have one of Trump's biggest bases, not people in trailer parks. So people in trailer parks don't tend to vote. I mean, I live in the middle of Trump country, and the base of support is small business people, local capitalists, professionals, and things like that. So you have this kind of province versus metropole dynamic taking place. And I think the similarity comes from the fact that both Turkey and the United States lack a labor party. It's tempting to compare Turkey to a European country in some ways, and in some ways that works. But Turkey, like the United States, did not develop a strong labor party. There were attempts. There was the Turkish Workers' Party in the 60s. But in essence, you had the emergence of a sort of state party, the Republican People's Party, which had been an authoritarian party in the 1930s. In the 1970s, taking a sort of social democratic shift in the country. So standing for secularism and then appropriating a lot of language of the left. And you see a similar dynamic in the United States with the Democratic Party moving in that direction. But neither of those parties were truly anchored to labor. So what we see in Turkey and the United States is a lot of political battles are, in a sense, intra-right-wing battles fought over symbols. So in Turkey, it's a right-wing battle over secularism. versus Islam. So in Turkey, when Erdogan first came to power, when he tried to put Abdullah Gül, his lieutenant, in as the president, there were protests of secular nationalists who, are not particularly left-wing on many issues. They just reject Islamism. And, if you look at the Democratic Party, we often talk about moderate Democrats, right? But we're really talking about conservative Democrats. We're talking about Democrats who, by and large, buy into the framing of politics that is offered by the Republican Party. They just don't think people should be overtly racist or uncouth. So, you have a politics which is orientated around this kind of cultural struggle, as opposed to even a superficial class struggle. And the result is that the political right, both in Turkey and in the United States, have been able to mobilize the resentment of people who feel left out or feel sort of culturally, not in the mainstream. And they've been able to play that very effectively. And as the parties have sort of degenerated even further, it enters into conspiracy theory. Because, terms like the deep state that we all know about today, that comes from Turkey, right? That term, the deep state, was originally used to talk about the sort of mafia, right-wing paramilitary, military alliances that would sort of undergird democratic politics in Turkey. So we have this kind of, we have these like interesting parallels in the sense that the ideological terrain in some ways between the Turkey and the United States are quite similar, in the sense that it's often framed as a cultural battle.
Yeah, and I mean, I guess I do want to just make sure that we hit this point, because one of the reasons that I thought it'd be interesting to revisit this now, right? The article was written 3 years ago, is because, so you say, for example, in the article, both Trump and Erdogan understand democracy in the crudest majoritarian sense of the word, holding liberal democratic rights in contempt, and validating their authoritarian impulses by touting their electoral success. Turkey's rapid slide toward authoritarianism is not being replicated in its entirety in the United States. America, unlike Turkey, still possesses an independent media and relatively open civil society, all of which is still basically true, right? And I don't think we should be, I don't think hysteria about fascism, really serves any strategic interest. But I think that it's safe to say that the authoritarian impulses that we've gotten in the Trump administration have gotten a little bit more undisguised in the last, few years, especially honestly in the last 6 months. That a lot of what you're talking about in your article, when you do talk about GOP authoritarianism in this country, had to do with state legislatures trying to do things to crack down on protests. And of course, a lot of that happened. A lot of that is very creepy, right? But I think we've seen much more of it from the presidential level lately, certainly in terms of doing things like deploying the military against protesters in Washington, D.C., sending the Department of Homeland Security to shove people into unmarked vans in Portland, and at least doing these unsettling trial balloons, like the president tweeting that we should delay the election, which obviously doesn't have any power to do, and he is still constrained by a legal system that's very different, than what exists in Turkey. But I think it's safe to say that the tendency, right, of the Trump administration has maybe gotten a little bit closer to the AKP model, since you wrote the article.
I would completely agree with that. Of course, we have these very important structural differences, but the impulse remains the same. And as you know, these things go from worse to worse. We see all these increasingly authoritarian attempts to play politics with things, to politicize the military, and to gradually dismantle those institutions. Now, but the question is one of is not a qualitative difference. Erdogan, to consolidate power, had to dismantle certain institutions within the Turkish state and consolidate his power over the AKP party. It was a process. We're seeing a similar kind of process now. Of course, the Republican Party is more independent at least institutionally, than the Justice and Development Party. American institutions and legal system is, well, in a sense, it's more diffuse. So it makes it, as a federal state, it's a lot harder to impose. Turkey has a strong unitary tradition. America is a federal state. It's harder to impose rule over the country because power is more diffuse. But I think you're exactly right. We've seen that slide towards authoritarian behavior. We've seen an increase in that crude majoritarianism, and it's. I mean, my joke is usually it's like Turkey's America 10 years in the future, because if you leave these people in power, it only emboldens them and only allows them to move further and further in towards that authoritarian mode. You just simply can't. You can't leave someone like Trump in power and expect that these institutions will just somehow manage to survive. We've seen over the course of the Trump administration the removal of professionals, whatever the problems we have with technocratic elites, but the removal of professionals from positions, imposition of cronies. And I mean, just look at Voice of America, for example, and the kind of people who are now being platformed on Voice of America. We see how that kind of shift takes place. And this is exactly the same shift that happened in Turkey. It's just Turkey as a country with weaker institutions and which never did have such a, Turkey, like America, makes a big deal about its revolution, which wasn't actually really very revolutionary. You have this you have this consolidation of power around an authoritarian leader. So people who think that, just because Trump's incompetent, that leaving him in office is not going to be dangerous for the future of democracy, completely don't understand how these kind of things, how authoritarians take power. Authoritarians are not necessarily geniuses or brilliant people, but they do have a sense of, their own preservation. And the longer they stay in power, the more likely they are to use sort of bureaucratic mechanisms and then, violent mechanisms to maintain that position, and it'll affect everything. So, I think that article, unfortunately, is held up pretty well because, we've seen the Republican Party hasn't had its an epiphany moment where they've been like, oh, Trump's gone too far. They've just got more and more subservient and venal towards him. So, I think, writing that, you always hope you're wrong, but
yeah, for sure.